Spring 1946, the war was over, but Central Texas still looked half at attention. Fences stood where no one guarded them anymore, and the wind carried the echo of languages that once belonged to enemies. At Camp Wallace, just east of Brenham, the last trainloads of German prisoners waited for repatriation. Most had been farmers, builders, or students before the war. Now they spent their final months turning boredom into work, mending roads, fixing roofs, repairing tractors. When the War Department announced that the camp would close by autumn, the new civilian liaison, a widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Evelyn Hart, suggested one final project. "Let's leave something green behind." The commanding officer chuckled. "Ma'am, they're prisoners, not landscapers," she smiled. "Farmers first, sir. And they're going home soon. Maybe they'd like to plant something worth remembering." That afternoon, Evelyn walked through the barracks yard with Sergeant Dieter Keller, the camp interpreter. He was 24, polite, precise, and tired of being measured by his accent. She handed him a folded sketch. An oval of paths around a small pond. "A peace garden," she said. "Native Texas trees mixed with German ones. Pecan, oak, beech, birch. You think they'd help?" Keller studied the drawing. "They will ask why Americans would want our trees." "Because peace needs roots from both sides," she answered. He smiled faintly. "Then we plant 2 for everyone ordered." The next morning, 30 prisoners lined up with shovels. The ground was hard clay, the air already hot by 9. Evelyn stood with a clipboard, sweat tracing her temples. When Keller translated her instructions, dig 3 feet, mix sand, add water. One man asked in German, "For whom is this?" Keller replied, "For anyone who ever thought enemies can't share shade." The men nodded, began to dig, and by noon the field had turned from brown to blotted green. Evelyn fetched lemonade from the commissary. The guards didn't object. They drank too. That day the barbed wire seemed to bend a little wider. Not everyone approved. The local newspaper printed an editorial. "Why waste good county land on trees planted by our former captives?" At the feed store, an old rancher muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Next they'll want to build statues." Evelyn kept silent. But that night, she walked the rows of young saplings and touched each tag the men had carved. Names in German, Latin, and English. One read Frieden Tree, Peace Tree. Another, simply Hope. 2 weeks later, a storm barreled across Brazos County. Lightning split one of the pecans clean down the trunk. By morning, half the garden lay flattened. Evelyn arrived to find Keller and his men replanting in the mud. "You don't have to," she began. Keller looked up, rain plastering his hair. "We planted them," he said. "We answer to the roots." She handed him her umbrella and took a shovel herself. They worked until sunset, clothes soaked, laughter breaking through thunder. When the sky cleared, a young army clerk snapped a photo. Evelyn and Keller standing side by side, holding the broken pecan upright with rope. Behind them, the garden stretched like a scar healing. The caption he wrote for the camp bulletin was simple: "Enemies plant for tomorrow." Elliot Miller, the Texas photographer from your previous episode, would later develop that image for a local paper, unaware that decades later it would resurface beside his other forgotten peace negatives. That night, Keller wrote to his mother in Bremen, "They let us plant trees, not for us, but for what comes after us. When the wind moves through them, perhaps it will sound like forgiveness." He folded the letter carefully, sealed it with a piece of ration tape, and pressed his fingerprint on the back like a signature of soil. By July, the saplings stood tall enough to cast small shadows. The camp prepared to close. Trucks waited by the gate. Evelyn asked the colonel for one final gathering. He relented. On the last afternoon, Americans and Germans stood together beneath the largest pecan. Keller read a short note in both languages. "We leave these trees so that one day children will not ask who planted them, only why they are beautiful." Then the men boarded the trucks. No speeches, just nods through the dust. When the last engine faded, Evelyn sat on a bench beneath the pecan and whispered, "Grow tall enough to make them remember." The trees did. By 1976, the bicentennial year, the garden had become a small park known locally as Friendship Grove. Few knew its origin. The sign simply read, "Dedicated to Peace, 1946. But when drought threatened that summer, a local journalist found the old photograph and printed the story again. It went statewide, then national. Enemy hands, American soil. Within months, school children came on field trips to water the trees. The grove became a living classroom. By 1976, The pecan trees at the edge of Brenham stood as tall as church spires. Their roots had broken through the clay, spreading under the fence line that no longer existed. The locals called the place Friendship Grove, but few knew who had planted it. Children climbed its branches, picnics spread beneath its shade, and time erased the accents that once echoed between the rows. Evelyn Hart was 70 now. Her hair had gone silver, her eyesight poor, but she still walked the grove every Sunday afternoon. She carried a tin watering can out of habit, though the trees no longer needed her. She would rest on the same bench the POWs had built, listening to the wind move through the leaves. It sounded the same as it had in 1946, like breath drawn in and finally released. That summer, Brenham planned a bicentennial fair, and a historian from Austin contacted Evelyn about the park. "We'd like to feature the grove as a symbol of post-war reconciliation," he said. "Could you tell us who planted it?" Evelyn smiled. "I could, but the trees already do," he pressed gently. "Do you remember any names?" "One," she said. "Keller. Dieter Keller." The historian blinked. "We received a letter from a man with that surname. He's coming from Bremen next month. He said his father once planted trees here." Evelyn nearly dropped her watering can. "He's coming?" "Yes, ma'am. He's bringing a delegation of teachers for a cultural exchange. We'd like you to meet them." When the plane landed in Houston that July, Evelyn was waiting in the terminal, clutching a small bouquet of bluebonnets. The man who stepped off the ramp was in his early 30s, with the same straight posture and calm eyes she remembered in his father. "You must be Mrs. Hart," he said, smiling. "I'm Matthias Keller." For a moment, she couldn't speak. "You look exactly like him," she whispered. He held out his hand. "My father told me that Texas gave him back his hands, because here, he used them to build instead of destroy." They drove to Brenham together, the air heavy with heat and the smell of wildflowers. When they reached Friendship Grove, Matthias stopped beside the old pecan. "He wrote of this place often," he said softly. "He said the wind in Texas forgave him." Evelyn touched the trunk, now wide enough to need 3 arms to encircle it. "He saved this one after the storm. It broke, but he tied it back up." Matthias smiled faintly. "My father always said broken things grow stronger when you let them." As they walked deeper into the grove, he knelt suddenly beside a root that had surfaced near the bench. "There's something here," he said, brushing away soil. Beneath the dirt, his fingers struck metal, a rusted tin box, sealed with solder. They took it to the county museum for careful opening. Inside were brittle envelopes wrapped in wax paper. Each bore a name in fading ink, and on top lay a folded note in English, written by Keller himself. "To whoever finds this, plant kindness where you are." The letters were in both German and English. Some were simple, describing families left behind, others reflections on the meaning of peace. One read, "We did not expect forgiveness, but we found work. In work, we learned the sound of peace." Another said, "We leave these trees to teach that shade belongs to no nation." Evelyn read them aloud, her voice trembling. Matthias stood behind her, hand resting on her shoulder. "They buried these before they left," he said quietly. "My father must have wanted them to grow like the roots." News of the discovery spread quickly. The local paper ran a headline, "Time Capsule Found Beneath Grove Planted by Former Enemies." Reporters came from Austin and Houston. The Brenham Historical Society scheduled a public reading beneath the pecan for September. On the day of the event, the town gathered. Veterans, farmers, children from the elementary school. The air smelled of sun-warmed bark and soil. Evelyn sat in a folding chair near the front, the letters stacked in her lap. Matthias stood beside her, translating the German passages. She began with the first. "We were told to build fences, but we built rows instead," she read, voice thin but steady. "Perhaps that will be remembered longer." The crowd listened silently as each letter unfolded, a chorus of apologies, gratitude, and hope written by men who once wore enemy uniforms. When she finished, Matthias opened a final small envelope, yellowed and fragile. The handwriting inside was hers. He looked up, stunned. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "did you write this?" She took it carefully. The ink had faded, but she recognized her own looping script. "To my students, should they ever read this garden, remember that peace is not a word. It is work," she exhaled, eyes wet. "I had forgotten I did that." The crowd stood in applause, the sound mingling with the wind moving through the leaves. After the ceremony, Matthias walked her back to her car. "When I return to Germany, may I tell them this?" "Tell them Texas kept its promise," she said. "The trees grew." Before he left, he gave her a small wooden box. Inside was a sapling wrapped in burlap, young, fragile. "A beech," he said, "from my father's garden in Bremen." He said Texas soil still owes him one more root. She laughed softly. Then I suppose we'll plant it next to his old tree. They did, that evening, with schoolchildren watching. She pressed the soil around it with her hands, the same way she had done 30 years before. The sun dipped low, turning the grove gold. When Matthias boarded his flight the next morning, he carried a branch from the pecan wrapped in linen, a gift from the town. For the other side of the wind, Evelyn had said. The story reached newspapers across both countries. Texas Grove becomes symbol of post-war friendship, one headline read. Letters poured in from former POWs and their families. Some enclosed faded photographs, others simply thanked the town for remembering. In Germany, Matthias planted the pecan branch beside his father's grave. In Brenham, the young beech took hold, its leaves pale and tender beside the dark Texas green. Years later, Evelyn would sit beneath the two trees, one born of war, the other of return, and listen to them whisper in the same wind. By the 1990s, Friendship Grove had outgrown the town that once doubted it. What began as a quiet stand of pecans and beeches now stretched across 20 acres, green even through the dry seasons. Couples picnicked there. School buses unloaded children who ran along the winding paths where fences used to stand. No one called it a POW garden anymore. It was simply the place Brenham used when they wanted to remember what kindness looked like. Evelyn Hart was gone by then. She'd passed in 1988, buried under the largest pecan tree. Her headstone was small, carved with her favorite words. Peace is work. Each spring, volunteers laid bluebonnets at its base. They said the soil there grew them bluer than anywhere else. The grove had become a state landmark, tended by a local historical committee. In 1994, the Texas Parks Department proposed renaming it the Hart Keller Peace Park to honor both sides of its story. To mark the dedication, Matthias Keller returned from Bremen with his teenage daughter, Lena. They brought with them a box of soil from his father's old garden, mixed with beech seeds from the same tree that once grew by the Weser River. The morning of the ceremony was bright and windless. The air smelled faintly of rain on oak. A crowd gathered around a wooden stage draped in two flags, Texas and Germany, fluttering gently side by side. The mayor spoke first, reminding everyone that when the camp closed in 1946, the world was still learning how to stop building walls. These trees, he said, gesturing to the grove, were the first roots of that lesson. Then Matthias stepped up to the microphone. He looked older than when he last stood here, his hair touched with gray, his hands rough from years of carpentry work. His voice, still carrying a trace of his father's accent, carried across the clearing. My father once told me, he said, that he planted trees in Texas to make peace grow faster than memory fades. I see now that he was right. You kept them alive. You kept him alive. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. Before she died, Mrs. Hart sent me a letter. I promised I would not open it until today. He unfolded the paper carefully, reading aloud. If the grove still stands when this letter is read, then you have done the work. Water it for someone you will never meet. Matthias paused, his eyes glistening. So we brought water. Lena stepped forward with a small silver flask filled with Weser River water. Together they poured it at the base of the pecan tree that had survived the storm half a century earlier. The crowd clapped softly. The wind stirred as if answering. After the ceremony, a young journalist approached Matthias with a folder. Mr. Keller, I think this belongs to you. Inside were photographs, recently donated to the county museum. Grainy, black and white images found in an attic in Waco. On the top was the one Evelyn had forgotten existed. She and Dieter, waist-deep in mud, holding the broken pecan upright with a rope, while a line of prisoners worked behind them. The caption on the back read simply, "Enemies plant for tomorrow." Matthias traced the image with his thumb. That's the day he decided he wasn't an enemy anymore, he said. The journalist smiled. We'd like to display it in the visitor center. Matthias nodded. As long as you hang it in daylight. That photograph became the centerpiece of the new park's exhibit hall. Underneath it hung a bilingual inscription. They came as prisoners. They left as planters. The shade belongs to everyone. A few years later, in 1999, a group of German forestry students visited Texas on a scholarship inspired by the Keller family. They collected seeds from the original pecans and beeches to take back to Bremen. Within a decade, a sister grove, Texas Freedom Park, stood on the banks of the Weser, its sign written in both languages. One of the first trees they planted there grew from the pecan Matthias had carried home in his youth. It flourished against the northern wind, its leaves broader than expected, its nuts rounder, Locals joked that it must have kept a little Texas in it. In 2010, a camera crew filming a documentary about reconciliation visited Brenham. The director asked Matthias, now gray and slower, to narrate under the old tree. "Why do you think these stories still matter?" she asked. He looked up into the canopy, sunlight flickering through layers of green. "Because we keep proving them," he said. "Every time someone forgives or rebuilds or plants something without asking who benefits, the story grows another ring." He reached out, resting his palm on the bark. "If you listen closely," he said, "the trees sound like breathing." The film aired internationally, and for months letters poured in again, from veterans, teachers, and families who'd never known such camps existed. Some enclosed acorns and seeds, promising to plant them for tomorrow. By 2020, seedlings from Friendship Grove had been planted in 10 countries. Each one descended from the garden that a widowed teacher and her so-called enemies started with borrowed shovels. Today, a bronze plaque marks the entrance. Friendship Grove, established 1946, born of war, grown by peace. Visitors still find small offerings left beneath the pecan. Folded letters, old medals, children's drawings. On quiet mornings, when the light filters through the leaves, you can almost see them, the shapes of men and women bent over fresh soil, turning earth that no longer divides them. If you stand still long enough, the breeze carries 2 voices through the branches, one in English, one in German, saying the same word.